The room goes quiet the moment Jeremy pushes the divorce papers across the table. Not the polite quiet of a courthouse waiting for the next case. The heavy kind. The kind that makes people stop shifting in their chairs. Jeremy signs his name with the same confidence he uses when closing million-dollar deals. Smooth, certain, almost bored. The pen slides across the paper, and when he finishes, he leans back like a man who just solved a small problem. Across the table, Stephine watches him. Her hands are still, her expression calm. Jeremy taps the paper lightly and nudges it toward her. "Your turn," he says. Stephine lowers her eyes to the document. For a brief moment, the room seems smaller, like every sound is holding its breath. She signs. No hesitation, no argument, just a quiet signature. Jeremy smiles. The woman sitting beside him smiles too, leaning closer to him as if the future is already theirs. Jeremy glances at Stephine one last time, confident, relaxed, almost amused. In his mind, he just upgraded his life. What Jeremy doesn't realize is that the woman he just walked away from never needed his money, his status, or his approval. Because the quiet woman sitting across from him is the daughter of a man worth more than Jeremy has ever imagined. If respect matters more than money to you, take a second to like the video and tell me in the comments what you think Jeremy deserves. Welcome to Mr. Graham's story, my beautiful, amazing family. Y'all have been so supportive, and I promise to always do my best to give you the best as I learn and improve every single day. If this is your first time watching my video, please comment below with where you're watching from, and hit subscribe to officially join the family here on Mr. Graham's Stories. Now let's talk about Houston. Houston is a city that loves success stories. Glass towers shining under the Texas sun, luxury cars moving through wide downtown streets, private clubs where people talk about business deals, investments, and who just made their first million. From the outside, it's a city where everything looks polished. Jeremy fit perfectly into that world. By his late 30s, he had built a company that moved faster than most people expected. Investors trusted him. Business magazines called him a rising name in Houston's tech and logistics circles. Money followed quickly. The corner office downtown, the expensive watches, the invitations to high-end events where people shook his hand a little longer than usual. To most people watching from the outside, Jeremy looked like a man who had everything figured out. A successful company, a beautiful home, and a wife named Stephine who stood beside him through the climb. But the truth about success is simple. Money doesn't change who you are. It just makes your real character easier to see. Houston wakes up early. By 7 in the morning, downtown is already alive with motion. Office workers hurry through wide sidewalks carrying coffee cups. Black SUVs glide through intersections. Glass towers reflect the bright Texas sun, turning entire blocks into mirrors of steel and light. From the outside, it feels like a city built for ambition. If someone wanted to reinvent themselves, Houston was the kind of place where that could happen. Jeremy understood that better than most people. By the time he reached his late 30s, he had built something many people only talk about during late-night conversations about dreams and luck. His company had grown fast, faster than anyone expected. What started as a small logistics technology startup had turned into a rapidly expanding operation connecting supply chains across several states. Investors began paying attention once revenue numbers started climbing. Jeremy knew how to speak their language. Confident, direct, always sounding like he already knew the outcome of every deal. That confidence opened doors. Soon his company moved into a sleek downtown office building with a corner suite overlooking the city. Floor-to-ceiling windows gave Jeremy a clear view of the skyline he now felt he belonged to. Employees respected him. Investors trusted him. Local business publications started mentioning his name in articles about emerging executives shaping Houston's future. And with success came everything that usually follows it. Better suits, better watches, better invitations. Jeremy began appearing at charity galas, rooftop networking events, and private dinners where conversations quietly mixed business and status. At those gatherings, people often asked about his story. How did you build the company so quickly? Jeremy always smiled before answering. Part of him enjoyed telling the story. Another part enjoyed the attention even more. But Jeremy rarely attended those events alone. Most evenings, Stephine stood beside him. Stephine didn't carry herself with the same calculated confidence Jeremy used in business rooms. Her presence was softer, warmer. When she spoke to people, she listened carefully instead of trying to impress them. Some guests noticed that difference immediately. While Jeremy talked about growth projections and market opportunities, Stephine asked people about their families, their hometowns, or how long they had lived in Houston. Conversations around her felt natural. Jeremy once told a colleague that Stephine had a way of making rooms feel relaxed. At the time, he meant it as a compliment. Stephine had grown up in Houston too, but her experience of the city looked very different from Jeremy's. She was raised in the 3rd Ward, a historic part of Houston where families often knew their neighbors well enough to greet them by name every morning. Her childhood was filled with simple routines that had nothing to do with boardrooms or business deals. Sunday afternoons meant large family meals, music drifting through open windows, children running between houses while adults talked on front porches. Stephine carried those memories with her long after she became part of Jeremy's world. Even when she stood inside luxury venues surrounded by polished marble floors and soft lighting, something about her still felt grounded in those earlier experiences. Jeremy noticed it too. In the beginning, that grounded nature was one of the things he admired about her. When they first started dating, Jeremy often felt like his life moved too fast. Meetings, deadlines, expansion plans, investor expectations. Stephine had a way of slowing conversations down. She reminded him to laugh more, to step outside during late evenings instead of staying trapped behind screens. At one point early in their relationship, Jeremy told a friend that Stephine made him feel balanced. But success changes the atmosphere around a person. As Jeremy's company expanded, the attention surrounding him grew louder. New investors came into the picture. Journalists requested interviews. Business acquaintances invited him into social circles that valued achievement almost as much as they valued appearances. Jeremy began enjoying those spaces more than he expected. Not just the opportunities, the recognition. The subtle shift in how people treated him once they learned about his financial success. Sometimes he noticed it during conversations. People leaning closer when he spoke. People laughing a little harder at his jokes. It felt good. Jeremy never said it out loud, but the attention reinforced something he had quietly believed for years. Winning mattered. And now he was winning. Stephine still accompanied him to events, still smiled when people introduced themselves, still asked thoughtful questions during conversations. But there were moments when Jeremy's focus drifted away from her. Moments when he stood across the room discussing investments or expansion strategies with wealthy guests who admired his ambition. In those moments, Jeremy felt completely at home. And as the months passed, that feeling began shaping how he saw his life, his company, his success, his place in Houston's growing business scene. From the outside, Jeremy and Stephine looked like a couple who had built something extraordinary together. A successful husband, a supportive wife, a beautiful home in one of Houston's quieter neighborhoods, a life that seemed stable and impressive. Most people who saw them believed the same thing. They believed Jeremy and Stephine had the kind of marriage people quietly envy. What those observers couldn't see yet was the slow shift happening inside Jeremy's mind, a shift that would eventually change the way he looked at Stephine. And once that shift fully settled in, their marriage would never feel the same again. Stephine had never been impressed by money. That wasn't something she said out loud very often. It was simply the way she lived. Growing up in Houston's 3rd Ward shaped that mindset long before Jeremy entered her life. In her neighborhood, success wasn't measured by how much someone earned. It was measured by how they treated people, how they showed up for family, and whether their word meant something when they gave it. Stephine's childhood home was rarely quiet. There was always someone visiting, an aunt stopping by after church, cousins running through the living room, older relatives telling stories that stretched late into the evening while laughter filled the house. Sunday dinners were almost sacred. Food covered the table. Music floated through the rooms. People talked about life, faith, work, and the small victories that mattered just as much as big ones. Stephine grew up watching the adults around her look out for one another. If someone lost a job, neighbors helped until they got back on their feet. If someone had good news, everyone celebrated together. That kind of environment teaches a person something powerful without ever turning it into a lecture. It teaches you that people matter more than appearances. Stephine carried that lesson with her as she grew older. By the time she met Jeremy, she had already developed the calm confidence that came from knowing exactly who she was. She didn't feel pressure to prove herself to anyone. Jeremy noticed that almost immediately. The first time they met, he had been used to a very different type of conversation. Many people he encountered were quick to talk about their ambitions, their connections, or what they hoped to gain from knowing someone successful. Stephine didn't do that. When Jeremy spoke about his company during their first long conversation, she listened carefully. But instead of focusing on how impressive the business sounded, she asked questions about why he started it. "What made you take the risk?" she asked. Jeremy remembered pausing for a moment before answering. Most people asked about profits. Stefan asked about purpose. That difference caught his attention. Over the following months, their relationship developed naturally. Jeremy admired Stefan's ability to stay calm even when his schedule became chaotic. She never seemed intimidated by the fast pace of his work. If anything, she helped him slow down when he needed it. There were evenings when Jeremy would arrive home frustrated after a long day of negotiations. Stefan would sit beside him, listening quietly while he talked through whatever problem was weighing on his mind. Sometimes she offered advice. Sometimes she simply let him speak until the tension faded. Jeremy once told her, half joking, that she should charge consulting fees for the clarity she brought to his thinking. Stefan laughed and told him she preferred simple conversations to invoices. During those early years, Jeremy often felt grateful for the balance she brought into his life. When business pressures increased, Stefan reminded him to rest. When his mind stayed locked on numbers and deadlines, she pulled him outside for walks through their neighborhood just to clear his head. At the time, Jeremy believed he understood Stefan completely. But understanding someone requires curiosity, and curiosity requires humility. As Jeremy's company grew larger, the rhythm of his life changed. More meetings filled his calendar. Investors demanded faster expansion. Business travel became frequent. The more success Jeremy experienced, the more his confidence hardened into something sharper. His tone shifted in small ways that were easy to overlook at first. Sometimes it appeared during casual conversations. Jeremy would speak about people who worked for him with a sense of authority that felt slightly different from before. Where he once talked about teamwork, he now talked more about control. Stefan noticed those changes quietly. She didn't confront him immediately because she believed relationships moved through seasons. Stress could make anyone act differently for a while. Instead, she tried to support him the same way she always had. If Jeremy came home late after a long day, she still asked how things went. If he sounded frustrated about employees or investors, she listened with patience. But the balance between them had begun shifting in ways Jeremy didn't recognize. Stefan still treated him with the same warmth she had always shown. Jeremy, however, had started measuring life through a different lens. Achievement, status, influence. Without realizing it, he began associating those things with personal value. And when a person begins tying their worth to success, it becomes easy to overlook the quiet strengths standing right beside them. Stefan remained steady. She didn't change her habits or her personality simply because Jeremy's world was expanding. She still believed kindness mattered. She still believed respect should never disappear inside a marriage. But Jeremy was slowly becoming someone who valued admiration more than understanding. Stefan sensed the shift long before Jeremy acknowledged it. Not through dramatic arguments, not through sudden conflicts, through small moments, the kind that most people ignore until they begin forming a pattern. Moments where Jeremy's words carried a tone that felt slightly different. Moments where the appreciation he once showed her seemed to fade behind his growing confidence. Stefan tried to keep peace between them, believing patience would guide their marriage back toward the balance they once shared. What she didn't realize yet was that Jeremy had already started seeing their relationship through a completely different perspective, and that quiet change would soon reveal itself in ways neither of them could ignore. The first clear shift in Jeremy didn't happen during a fight. It happened at a dinner party. Jeremy had started attending more private gatherings with investors and business associates. These weren't the large charity events where hundreds of people moved from table to table. These dinners were smaller, more selective, 8 or 10 people at most. The kind of evenings where expensive wine flowed freely and conversations quietly mixed money, ambition, and reputation. One Friday evening, Jeremy and Stefan arrived at a modern home near downtown Houston for one of those dinners. The house itself looked like something pulled from a luxury magazine. High ceilings, clean white walls, large windows showing the glow of the city skyline outside. Inside, a long dining table had already been prepared. Soft music played in the background while guests gathered with drinks in their hands. Jeremy moved through the room comfortably, greeting people with easy confidence. A few of the guests had already done business with him before. Others had heard about the growth of his company and wanted to meet the man behind it. Stefan stayed close beside him, smiling politely whenever someone introduced themselves. As always, she listened more than she spoke. At one point during the evening, The group moved toward the dining table. Plates were passed around, and conversations grew louder as people relaxed. One of the guests leaned toward Jeremy. "So Jeremy," the man said with a curious smile, "I heard your company doubled its contracts this year. That's impressive." Jeremy nodded, clearly pleased. "It's been a strong year," he replied. Someone else at the table raised a glass. "To smart leadership," the person said. The group chuckled, clinking glasses lightly. Jeremy accepted the praise easily. Stevine watched quietly, happy for him. She knew how many long nights he had spent building his company. She remembered the early days when success wasn't guaranteed. For a moment, the atmosphere felt warm, but the tone of the conversation changed slightly when someone turned toward Stevine. "And what about you?" one of the guests asked kindly. "What do you do?" Stevine smiled. "I spend most of my time working with community programs," she explained, mentoring young students and helping organize local events back in the Third Ward. A few people nodded politely. Before anyone else could respond, Jeremy chuckled softly beside her. "It keeps her busy," he said. The comment sounded harmless at first, but Jeremy continued speaking. "Stevine grew up in the Third Ward," he added, leaning back in his chair. "Some of those habits stay with you. She still prefers big family dinners over these formal events." A few guests laughed lightly. Stevine smiled politely. She had heard Jeremy mention her upbringing before, but something about the way he said it this time felt different. Not cruel, but slightly dismissive. Jeremy kept talking. "Don't get me wrong," he added with a grin. "It's kind of charming. She reminds me not everyone grew up around business meetings." More laughter spread around the table. Stevine lowered her eyes to her plate for a moment, letting the moment pass. No one at the table meant any harm. Most of them probably believed Jeremy was teasing affectionately, but Stevine understood tone. She could hear the quiet message beneath Jeremy's words. He wasn't praising her background. He was separating it from his world. Later in the evening, another conversation drifted toward how people met their spouses. One of the guests asked Jeremy how he and Stevine first started dating. Jeremy leaned back in his chair again. "I met her during a community fundraiser," he said casually. Then he added with a small shrug, "She was working the event. I guess you could say I upgraded her lifestyle." More laughter filled the table. Stevine felt something tighten quietly in her chest. Again, she smiled politely, but inside, the comment landed differently. Jeremy had never described their relationship that way before. Upgraded her lifestyle. Stevine knew the guests probably heard the sentence as playful bragging. In wealthy social circles, comments like that were often treated like harmless jokes. But Stevine understood something deeper. Jeremy believed it. Not completely, not yet. But the idea had begun forming in his mind, that his success had elevated her life. And if a person begins believing they elevated someone, they eventually begin believing that person owes them gratitude. The dinner continued with laughter and conversation. Stevine remained gracious, asking questions and engaging with the guests around her. Anyone watching from across the table would have seen a composed woman enjoying the evening. Jeremy seemed equally relaxed, but something small had shifted. A thin line had appeared in their marriage. Stevine noticed it clearly. Jeremy did not. On the drive home later that night, the car remained quiet. Streetlights passed through the windshield as they moved through Houston's evening traffic. Jeremy hummed softly to music playing on the radio. Stevine stared out the window, thinking. Not angry, not hurt enough to start an argument, just thoughtful. Because sometimes the most important changes in a relationship don't arrive through dramatic moments. They appear quietly, in jokes that sound slightly different, in comments that reveal how someone truly sees you. Stevine realized something during that drive home. Jeremy no longer spoke about their life as something they built together. He had started talking as if he was the one who lifted her into a better world. And that belief was the first crack in the foundation of their marriage. The house Jeremy and Stevine lived in was large enough that silence could stretch across it without effort. When they first moved in, the quiet felt peaceful. It was the kind of home people imagined when they thought about success. Wide living spaces, large windows facing the street, a dining table long enough to seat several guests comfortably. In the early years, evenings there felt warm. Stevine would sometimes cook while music played softly in the kitchen. Jeremy would walk in after work, loosen his tie, and lean against the counter while telling her about the day. Those small routines once felt natural, but routines change when people stop protecting them. Not long after the dinner party where Jeremy joked about her upbringing, his schedule began shifting again. At first, the changes seemed reasonable. Jeremy started arriving home later than usual. He explained it easily. Investors want updates, he told Stephen one evening while placing his phone on the kitchen counter. Growth like this comes with pressure. Stephen understood pressure. She had watched Jeremy build his company from the beginning. She knew success often required long hours. So she nodded and listened. But over the following weeks, those late evenings became normal. Jeremy stopped calling ahead to say when he would arrive. Sometimes Stephen finished dinner alone before he walked through the door. Other nights she waited, hoping they would at least eat together. Eventually, she stopped setting the table for two. One quiet evening, Stephen sat at the dining table scrolling through messages on her phone while a plate of food cooled in front of her. The clock on the wall read nearly 9 o'clock. When the front door finally opened, Jeremy walked in looking distracted. His jacket hung loosely over his arm while he tapped a quick message on his phone before even looking up. "You're late," Stephen said gently. Jeremy glanced at the clock. "Meeting ran long," he replied, placing his phone on the table. Stephen studied his face for a moment. "Do you want me to warm the food?" Jeremy shook his head. "I grabbed something earlier." Stephen nodded slowly. That simple answer ended the conversation before it had a chance to begin. Jeremy walked toward the living room, opening his laptop on the coffee table. The quiet inside the house felt heavier than usual. Stephen watched him from across the room before finally standing and clearing the untouched plate from the table. This pattern repeated itself often. Jeremy became more absorbed in work every week. When he wasn't physically at the office, his attention remained tied to emails, calls, or messages flashing across his phone. Stephen tried to reconnect several times. One night she brought 2 cups of tea into the living room and placed one beside him. Jeremy barely looked up from the screen. "Thanks," he muttered. Stephen sat across from him. For a few minutes she waited for Jeremy to speak first. He didn't. Finally she asked quietly, "How was your day?" Jeremy sighed slightly while continuing to type. "Busy." Stephen leaned back in her chair. "Every day is busy," she said gently. Jeremy closed the laptop halfway and rubbed his forehead. "Stephen, the company is expanding. That's a good thing." "I know it is." "Then why does this sound like a complaint?" Stephen hesitated before answering. "It's not a complaint," she said carefully. Jeremy looked at her with mild impatience. "Then what is it?" Stephen held his gaze for a moment. "We don't talk anymore." The sentence settled into the room quietly. Jeremy leaned back against the couch. "We're talking right now." Stephen shook her head. "That's not what I mean." Jeremy let out a slow breath, the kind people release when they believe a conversation is becoming unnecessarily complicated. "Stephen," he said, choosing his words carefully, "I run a company. I have employees depending on me. Investors expecting results. I understand that. Then you know I don't have unlimited time to sit around discussing feelings every evening." Stephen felt the weight of those words more than the volume. Jeremy hadn't raised his voice, but the message was clear. In his mind, emotional conversations had become an inconvenience. Stephen looked down at the cup of tea resting untouched in her hands. "I'm not asking for hours," she said quietly. "Just a conversation sometimes." Jeremy reopened his laptop. "We are having one." But Stephen already knew the conversation had ended. Jeremy's attention returned to the glowing screen. Numbers, emails, strategy plans, all the things that now seemed more important than the woman sitting a few feet away. Stephen sat quietly for another minute before standing and carrying her cup back to the kitchen. The house returned to silence. But this time the silence felt different. Stephen had just realized something she had been slowly sensing for weeks. Jeremy was no longer emotionally present in their marriage. And when a person begins leaving a relationship emotionally, their body often follows not long after. After the conversation about their growing silence, Stephen hoped something might shift. Not dramatically. She wasn't expecting Jeremy to suddenly abandon his work schedule or return to the long evenings they used to spend talking. She understood the demands of running a growing company, but she believed that once she spoke honestly, Jeremy might at least notice the distance forming between them. For a few days she watched carefully. Jeremy continued leaving early in the mornings. His routine had become almost mechanical. Coffee, phone, a quick glance at his calendar. Then he was out the door before the sun fully settled over the neighborhood. Stephen stayed busy with her own commitments. She continued working with the community programs she cared about, mentoring young students and helping organize local events in the neighborhoods she had grown up around. Those activities kept her grounded. But even during the busiest days, her thoughts occasionally returned to Jeremy, not with suspicion, just quiet concern. That concern slowly turned into something harder to ignore. It started with small details. One evening, Jeremy came home later than usual again. Stephine was sitting on the couch reading when she heard the front door open. Jeremy walked inside looking tired, but strangely upbeat. "Long day?" Stephine asked. Jeremy loosened his tie and nodded. "You could say that." Stephine stood and stepped closer as he placed his jacket on the chair near the door. That was when she noticed the scent. It was subtle, but it wasn't familiar. Stephine paused for a moment, her eyes lingering on Jeremy's jacket. Jeremy didn't seem to notice her reaction. He'd already picked up his phone, scrolling through messages. Stephine said nothing. A different scent on someone's clothes could mean many things. A crowded elevator, a handshake with someone wearing strong perfume. She pushed the thought aside. But over the next several days, other things began adding themselves quietly to the list of observations she couldn't fully explain. Jeremy started guarding his phone more closely. Before, it had been common for his phone to sit face up on the table while they ate dinner. Now it rarely left his hand. Sometimes messages appeared late at night, the screen lighting up briefly in the darkened living room. Jeremy would glance at it quickly before turning the phone face down. Stephine noticed those small actions without commenting. She had never been someone who believed in searching through someone else's belongings. Trust mattered too much to her. But trust also depends on honesty, and Jeremy's behavior had begun drifting into unfamiliar territory. One evening, Jeremy returned home later than usual again. The house was quiet except for the soft hum of the kitchen refrigerator. Stephine had just finished washing dishes when she heard him enter. "Hey," Jeremy said, stepping inside. Stephine dried her hands with a towel. "You're later than usual tonight." "Work dinner," Jeremy replied quickly. Stephine nodded. "What restaurant?" Jeremy hesitated for a fraction of a second before answering. "Just a place near the office." Stephine watched his face carefully. The answer sounded vague. Not wrong. Just incomplete. Jeremy walked past her toward the kitchen counter, picking up a glass and filling it with water. Stephine noticed something else as he moved past her. The same unfamiliar perfume from earlier in the week. This time, it was stronger. She felt her chest tighten slightly. Still, she remained calm. Jeremy drank the water and placed the glass down. "Big day tomorrow," he said casually. Stephine leaned against the counter. "Jeremy," she said softly. He glanced up. "Yes?" Stephine studied him for a moment before speaking again. "You seem different lately." Jeremy frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" "You're distant." Jeremy shrugged. "I'm busy." Stephine shook her head gently. Busy doesn't usually change how someone looks at their partner. Jeremy's expression hardened just a little. "Stephine, I already told you the company is growing." "I know. Then why do we keep coming back to this?" Stephine didn't answer right away. Instead, she picked up the dish towel again and folded it slowly on the counter. "I just want to understand what's going on," she said quietly. Jeremy checked his phone again. "Nothing is going on." The answer came too quickly. Stephine heard it. She didn't argue. But something inside her shifted. Over the following days, Jeremy became even less careful. Phone calls that ended abruptly when she entered the room. Messages that appeared late at night. Even occasional smiles at his phone that he never explained. Stephine never confronted him immediately. She observed. She listened. She waited. Because sometimes people reveal the truth without realizing it. And Stephine had begun recognizing a painful pattern. Jeremy wasn't just distracted. He wasn't just tired. He was emotionally invested somewhere else. The realization settled slowly but firmly. Stephine stood one evening in their quiet kitchen, staring out the window at the streetlights outside. For weeks she had been trying to explain Jeremy's behavior in ways that protected their marriage. Stress, pressure, work demands. But the evidence forming around her made one possibility harder to deny. Jeremy's distance had a reason, and that reason likely involved another woman. Stephine closed her eyes briefly, letting the thoughts settle fully in her mind. Not panic, not anger, just clarity. Because once a person begins seeing the truth clearly, the next conversation becomes unavoidable, and Stephine knew that conversation was coming soon. The tension inside the house had been building for weeks. Stevine felt it every time Jeremy walked through the door and avoided eye contact. Every time his phone lit up and he turned the screen away. Every time he answered a simple question with a short reply that closed the conversation. She had given him space. She had given him patience. But patience doesn't stop the truth from arriving. One evening, the truth finally stepped into the room. Jeremy came home earlier than usual that night. The sun had barely disappeared beyond the rooftops outside when the front door opened. Stevine was in the dining room placing 2 plates on the table. For a moment, she almost smiled. It had been a long time since Jeremy arrived home early enough for dinner. "Hey," Jeremy said as he walked in. Stevine looked up. "You're home early." Jeremy nodded, setting his phone on the table near the door. "Yeah." Stevine studied him for a moment. Something about his expression felt different. Not rushed, not distracted, more like someone who had already made a decision. She pulled out a chair and gestured toward the table. "Dinner's ready." Jeremy sat down slowly. For a few minutes, the only sound in the room was the quiet clink of silverware touching plates. Stevine noticed Jeremy barely touched his food. Finally, he placed his fork down. "Stevine," he said. His voice carried a tone she hadn't heard before. Not defensive, not irritated, just direct. Stevine set her fork down as well. "Yes?" Jeremy leaned back slightly in his chair. "There's something we need to talk about." Stevine held his gaze calmly. "I figured." Jeremy looked surprised by that answer. "You did?" Stevine nodded once. Jeremy exhaled slowly. "I've been seeing someone." The words settled into the room with a strange calmness. Stevine didn't gasp. She didn't raise her voice. She simply absorbed the sentence and let it sit between them. After a moment, she asked quietly, "For how long?" Jeremy rubbed his hands together as if organizing his thoughts. "A few months." Stevine nodded slowly. Her voice remained steady. "So the late nights." Jeremy didn't deny it. "Yes." Stevine looked down briefly at the table before meeting his eyes again. "Does she know you're married?" Jeremy hesitated before answering. "Yes." Stevine leaned back in her chair. For the first time since the conversation began, a small silence filled the room. Jeremy seemed almost relieved now that the truth had been spoken aloud. "She understands my world," he continued. Stevine frowned slightly. "What does that mean?" Jeremy searched for the right words. "She understands the pressure, the environment I operate in, the expectations." Stevine tilted her head slightly. "And I don't." Jeremy sighed. "That's not what I'm saying." "Then explain it." Jeremy paused again. "It's just different with her," he said. Stevine felt the weight of that sentence immediately. "Different." Jeremy continued speaking, almost as if he had been rehearsing the explanation. "She doesn't make everything emotional," he said. "She understands the lifestyle that comes with running a company." Stevine stared at him. "So, what exactly are you saying?" Jeremy looked at her directly now. "I think we've grown apart." Stevine let out a quiet breath. "That's the explanation?" Jeremy leaned forward slightly. "Stevine, we've been heading in different directions for a while." Stevine shook her head slowly. "No, Jeremy, you've been heading in a different direction." Jeremy didn't respond immediately. Stevine continued speaking. "You didn't talk to me about problems in our marriage. You didn't ask to work on anything." Jeremy's expression tightened. "Sometimes relationships just run their course." Stevine studied his face carefully. "Or sometimes people stop trying." Jeremy ran a hand through his hair. "Look, I didn't come home tonight to argue." "Then why did you come home?" Jeremy answered without hesitation. "I think we should get a divorce." The sentence hung in the air like a door quietly closing. Stevine felt a strange calm settle over her. She had expected anger to appear, or grief. Instead, she felt something else. Clarity. "You've already decided," she said softly. Jeremy nodded. "Yes." Stevine looked around the dining room for a moment. The house, the table, the life they had built together. Then she looked back at him. "Does she know you're planning to leave your wife for her?" Jeremy nodded again. "Yes." Stevine's lips pressed together briefly. "And you believe that relationship will work?" Jeremy didn't hesitate. "I do." Stevine held his gaze for a long moment. Then she nodded once. "All right." Jeremy blinked. "You're okay with that?" Stevine stood up from the table and began collecting the dishes calmly. "I'm not okay with it," she said. "But I'm not going to beg someone to stay in a marriage they've already left." Jeremy watched her quietly as she carried the plates toward the kitchen. For a moment, the confidence he had walked in with earlier seemed slightly uncertain. Stephen rinsed one plate under the sink before turning back toward him. "You should file the paperwork," she said gently. Jeremy looked surprised again. "You're not going to fight this?" Stephen shook her head. "No." Jeremy frowned slightly. "That was easier than I expected." Stephen dried her hands slowly with a towel. "Jeremy," she said calmly, "the marriage ended the moment you chose someone else." Jeremy had no response. Stephen turned off the kitchen light and walked toward the hallway. The house fell quiet again. But this time, the silence meant something different. Jeremy believed he had just taken control of his future. Stephen understood something else entirely. The man she married had already disappeared, and there was nothing left worth fighting for. The morning of the divorce arrived with a strange kind of stillness. Houston had already started its usual weekday rhythm. Cars moved steadily through downtown streets and office buildings filled with workers beginning their day. For most people in the city, it was an ordinary morning. For Jeremy and Stephen, it was the closing chapter of their marriage. The courthouse stood several blocks from the heart of downtown. The building itself looked solid and practical, the kind of place designed for decisions that permanently changed people's lives. Jeremy arrived first. He stepped out of his car wearing a dark suit that fit him perfectly. His posture carried the same confidence he displayed during important business meetings. To Jeremy, this moment felt less like an emotional ending and more like a legal formality. He walked through the courthouse entrance with steady steps, barely glancing at the other people moving through the hallways. A few individuals sat quietly along the walls waiting for their own hearings. Some looked nervous. Others looked exhausted. Jeremy felt neither. In his mind, the decision had already been made weeks earlier when he told Stephen the marriage was over. Everything happening today was simply paperwork catching up with reality. He checked his watch once before sitting down on one of the wooden benches outside the courtroom. Minutes later, Stephen arrived. Jeremy noticed her immediately. She walked into the hallway wearing a simple outfit, nothing flashy, nothing dramatic. Her expression remained calm, the same quiet composure she had carried since the night Jeremy admitted the affair. Stephen paused briefly when she saw Jeremy. Their eyes met for a moment. Jeremy gave a small nod. Stephen returned the nod politely before sitting down on a bench across from him. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing left to say. For several minutes the hallway remained quiet except for the faint sound of footsteps echoing through the corridor. Then Jeremy's attention shifted toward the entrance again. The woman he had chosen over Stephen had arrived. She walked toward Jeremy confidently and sat beside him, leaning close enough that their shoulders touched. Jeremy greeted her with a relaxed smile. Stephen noticed the gesture but didn't react. Instead, she folded her hands calmly in her lap and stared ahead at the closed courtroom door. Anyone watching the three of them would have seen a strange contrast. Jeremy appeared comfortable. His new partner looked pleased to be there. Stephen remained quiet, almost distant. But her stillness wasn't weakness. It was clarity. Inside her mind, the emotional struggle had already ended. Jeremy, however, viewed the morning very differently. To him, this moment represented a new beginning, a cleaner future. He believed he had made a difficult but necessary choice. Jeremy glanced toward Stephen once more. For a brief moment he studied her face, almost expecting to see sadness or anger. Instead, he saw something else. Peace. That unsettled him slightly. He had expected more resistance during the divorce process, more emotion, more arguments. But Stephen had simply agreed. Jeremy pushed the thought aside. The courtroom door opened. A clerk stepped out and called their case. Jeremy stood immediately. Stephen rose from her seat a second later. Without exchanging another word, they walked toward the door. Jeremy stepped forward first. Stephen followed behind him quietly. As they entered the courtroom together for the final time as husband and wife, Jeremy felt certain of one thing. He believed he was walking into a better life. What he didn't understand yet was that some decisions don't reveal their consequences until much later, and by the time those consequences appear, the chance to undo them is usually gone. The courtroom was quiet when Jeremy and Stephen walked inside. It wasn't the dramatic kind of quiet people often imagined from television scenes. There were no raised voices or emotional outbursts. Just the steady rhythm of a place where life decisions were finalized every single day. Rows of wooden benches filled the room. A large desk stood at the front where the judge would normally preside, but today the process was simpler. The divorce had already been negotiated. What remained was confirmation and signatures. Jeremy took a seat at the long table near the front of the room. Stevine sat across from him. The woman Jeremy had chosen to build a new life with settled into a seat slightly behind him. She leaned back comfortably, observing the room with quiet interest. Stevine noticed her presence but didn't allow it to disturb her focus. A stack of documents rested on the table between Jeremy and Stevine. Legal papers, agreements, the final written record of a marriage that had once promised something very different. Jeremy reached for the documents first. He picked up the stack and began reading through the pages carefully. His expression looked exactly the same as it did during business negotiations. Focused, methodical. He flipped through each section, scanning paragraphs and confirming the details. Stevine watched him for a moment. Jeremy had always been precise when it came to contracts. Even in moments like this, his instincts pushed him to review every line. Finally, Jeremy placed the pages back on the table. Everything looked exactly the way he expected. Assets divided. Responsibilities settled. The marriage officially ending. He picked up the pen resting beside the papers. Without hesitation, Jeremy signed his name on the designated lines. The motion felt familiar to him. He had signed hundreds of documents throughout his career. This signature felt no different. Once he finished, Jeremy slid the papers across the table toward Stevine. "Your turn," he said casually. Stevine looked down at the documents. For a moment, her eyes moved across the pages slowly. Not because she needed to review the legal language. She had already read everything weeks earlier. Instead, she was simply acknowledging what the papers represented. Years of memories. Years of effort. Years of believing she and Jeremy were building something together. Now all of it had been reduced to a few signatures. Stevine picked up the pen. Her hand moved steadily across the page as she wrote her name. No hesitation, no trembling, just a quiet acceptance of reality. When she finished, she placed the pen back on the table. Jeremy leaned back in his chair. Then he smiled. It wasn't a cruel smile. It wasn't mocking or dramatic. It was the relaxed smile of a man who believed he had successfully closed an important chapter of his life. Stevine noticed it immediately. That smile would stay in her memory long after the courtroom emptied. Jeremy reached forward and gathered the documents together again. From the seat behind him, the woman who had entered his life during the final months of the marriage leaned slightly closer. She looked pleased. Jeremy glanced toward Stevine again. "You'll be fine," he said. The words came out casually, almost reassuring, but Stevine understood the deeper meaning behind them. Jeremy believed he had been the stronger partner in their marriage, the one with financial power, the one with business success, the one who had provided the lifestyle they shared. In his mind, Stevine's life had been tied closely to his success. So when he said she would be fine, it sounded less like encouragement and more like a quiet assumption that she would simply move on with whatever remained after the divorce. Stevine held his gaze for a moment. Her expression didn't change. She didn't argue. She didn't challenge the statement. Instead, she gave a small nod. "I will be," she replied calmly. Jeremy seemed satisfied with that answer. To him, the situation looked settled. Clean. Simple. He believed both of them would continue their lives in different directions without much difficulty. Stevine stood from her chair. The courtroom suddenly felt smaller than it had earlier. Jeremy also stood, adjusting his jacket slightly. The woman behind him rose as well, stepping closer as if she already belonged at his side. Stevine noticed the movement. Still, she didn't react. The legal process was finished. The marriage had officially ended. Stevine walked toward the exit quietly. Jeremy remained behind for a moment, while the documents were collected. Before leaving, he glanced once more toward the door Stevine had just walked through. For the briefest second, a strange feeling passed through his mind. Something he couldn't quite name, but the feeling disappeared almost as quickly as it arrived. Jeremy turned toward the woman beside him and smiled again. Together, they walked out of the courtroom. In Jeremy's mind, the future looked bright. He believed he had made the correct decision. He believed he had chosen the path that would bring him greater happiness. What Jeremy didn't understand yet was that the biggest mistake of his life had just been finalized with a single signature. When Jeremy stepped outside the courthouse, the Texas sun had climbed higher into the sky. The air felt warm, the kind of late-morning heat Houston was known for. Cars moved steadily along the street, and people walked past the courthouse steps without paying attention to the quiet ending of a marriage that had just taken place inside. Jeremy paused near the entrance and adjusted his watch. For him, the moment felt strangely light. The decision had been made. The papers were signed. There was no more tension waiting at home, no more uncomfortable conversations about distance or loyalty. In Jeremy's mind, life had simply moved forward. Beside him, the woman who had become the center of his new life slipped her arm gently through his. Jeremy smiled down at her, confident and relaxed. They walked down the courthouse steps together. Behind them, Stephine exited the building a few minutes later. She stopped briefly at the top of the steps. For a moment she watched Jeremy walking away without looking back. Stephine didn't feel the urge to call his name. She didn't feel the need to explain anything. Instead, she simply observed the man she had once loved disappearing into the life he had chosen. Then she turned in the opposite direction. Her steps were steady as she walked toward the street. To an outside observer, it might have looked like Stephine had just lost everything. Her marriage had ended. Her husband had chosen someone else. The life she once shared with Jeremy was officially over, but appearances can be misleading. Because the truth about Stephene's life was something Jeremy had never fully understood. Not because she had hidden it with lies, but because he had never been curious enough to ask. Jeremy knew where Stephine grew up. He knew she came from Houston's 3rd Ward. He knew she valued community programs and mentorship work. What he never explored were the deeper layers of her life. He never asked how she managed to attend one of the best universities in Texas without accumulating the heavy student debt many graduates carried. He never questioned how certain opportunities had quietly appeared during her early career. He simply assumed Stephine had built everything through scholarships and hard work, and in many ways, she had. But there was another part of the story Jeremy never investigated: Stephene's father. He was not a public figure. His name rarely appeared in newspapers. He didn't attend social events or seek recognition for his success. His philosophy about wealth had always been simple. Money should create stability, not attention. For decades, he had quietly built a business empire that stretched across multiple industries: real estate, logistics, infrastructure investments, the kind of ventures that produced enormous returns without attracting headlines. While Jeremy proudly displayed his success in business circles, Stephene's father preferred to remain invisible. To him, reputation mattered more than publicity. When Stephine was younger, he had made one thing very clear to her. "Never let money define who you are," he once told her during a quiet conversation at their family home. Stephine had been preparing for college at the time. "Why?" she asked. Her father smiled gently. "Because money can disappear," he replied. "Character is what people remember." Stephine carried those words with her long after she left home. When she attended college, her father helped pay the tuition quietly. Not with grand gestures, not with public announcements, just quiet support that allowed her to focus on her education without the burden many of her classmates faced. Stephine never bragged about it. She never used her family's wealth to gain attention. Even when she met Jeremy, she never felt the need to mention it. Jeremy had been proud of his independence. He spoke often about building his company through determination and long hours. Stephine respected that drive. She admired it. So she never interrupted those conversations by explaining that financial security had existed in her life long before she met him. Jeremy simply assumed he had introduced Stephine to a higher level of comfort. He believed he had opened doors she might never have reached otherwise. Stephine never corrected him, not because she felt embarrassed, but because she believed relationships should be built on genuine connection, not financial comparisons. Jeremy never asked deeper questions. He never wondered why Stephine seemed so calm about money. He never questioned why she never appeared impressed by luxury. Now, as Jeremy walked away from the courthouse feeling victorious, he carried the same assumption he had held throughout their marriage: that Stephine needed him more than he needed her. What Jeremy didn't realize yet was that the woman he had just divorced had never depended on him for anything. She had chosen him, and there is a powerful difference between being needed and being chosen. Jeremy had mistaken Stephene's quiet independence for simplicity. He had mistaken her humility for a lack of options. And by the time he eventually discovered the truth about the life she came from, the opportunity to repair his mistake would already be gone. In the months after the divorce, Jeremy's life looked impressive from the outside. The transition into his new relationship happened quickly, almost effortlessly. The woman who had once been a quiet secret during the final months of his marriage was now openly beside him everywhere he went. Publicly, everything about Jeremy's life seemed to confirm that he had made the right decision. His company continued growing. Investors remained satisfied, and his personal life appeared more exciting than ever. Jeremy started traveling more frequently. Business trips that once felt exhausting now blended easily with leisure. When meetings finished in cities like Miami or Los Angeles, the evenings often turned into private dinners, rooftop gatherings, and exclusive events where success was celebrated openly. The woman beside him seemed to enjoy that environment. She dressed for it. She spoke about it easily. At those gatherings, Jeremy noticed how comfortably she moved through conversations about luxury brands, investment opportunities, and social connections. For a while, Jeremy believed he had found someone who truly understood his world. Their weekends often followed a similar pattern: late brunches in high-end restaurants, afternoons spent browsing luxury stores or attending invitation-only events connected to Jeremy's growing business reputation, evenings surrounded by people who spoke confidently about wealth, influence, and opportunity. Jeremy felt energized by it. The excitement of this lifestyle seemed to confirm something he had quietly believed when he finalized the divorce: that his life was now aligned with people who shared the same ambitions. He began appearing more frequently in business media again. Articles mentioned his company's growth and his increasing influence in Houston's expanding technology sector. Photographs occasionally showed him attending events with his new partners standing beside him. Everything looked polished, successful, forward-moving. At times, Jeremy caught himself comparing this new life with the quieter years he had spent married to Stevine. Those years suddenly seemed calmer by comparison, less flashy, less socially active. Back then, many of Jeremy's evenings had ended at home. Stevine often preferred quiet dinners over crowded events. She rarely showed interest in attending the endless social gatherings that came with Jeremy's growing reputation. At the time, Jeremy had interpreted that preference as a difference in ambition. Now, surrounded by people who enjoyed the spotlight as much as he did, Jeremy believed he had simply found someone better suited for his lifestyle. For several months, that belief felt convincing. Jeremy's calendar filled with activity, travel, events, celebrations connected to his company's achievements. The woman beside him appeared happy with every part of that world. She complimented his success openly. She admired the attention he received. She encouraged him to attend even more gatherings that placed him in front of influential people. From the outside, it looked like the perfect match. Yet somewhere beneath the surface of all that activity, something felt slightly different. Jeremy didn't notice it immediately. The excitement of the new relationship and the energy of his expanding career kept him distracted. But slowly, small moments began appearing that felt strangely empty. Sometimes it happened after events ended. Jeremy would return home late at night after hours of conversation and laughter, only to sit quietly for a moment before going to bed. The house felt different now, louder during the day, strangely quiet afterward. Other times the feeling appeared during travel. Jeremy and his partner might sit across from each other at a beautiful restaurant in another city, surrounded by music and expensive decor. The conversation flowed easily at first. Talk about upcoming trips. Talk about business deals. Talk about social events they planned to attend. But once those topics ended, the conversations rarely moved deeper. Jeremy noticed it occasionally, a pause where meaningful discussion might have existed. But instead, the moment passed quickly and another light topic replaced it. At first, Jeremy dismissed those moments. Every relationship has adjustments. Every new chapter of life requires time to settle. Still, the thought returned more often than he expected. His new life looked exciting. It looked successful. It looked exactly like the future Jeremy had imagined when he decided to leave his marriage. But appearances can sometimes hide uncomfortable truths, and Jeremy was slowly beginning to sense something he couldn't yet explain. The excitement surrounding his new life felt real on the surface, yet underneath that surface, something important was missing. At first, Jeremy ignored the quiet feeling that something was missing. Life around him still looked impressive. His company continued expanding, his calendar remained full, and the woman beside him seemed perfectly comfortable with the lifestyle that surrounded him. From the outside, nothing appeared wrong. But relationships reveal their true nature in the small, ordinary moments that happen when no one else is watching. Jeremy began noticing those moments more often. One evening, they sat across from each other at a restaurant overlooking downtown Houston. The lights from nearby buildings reflected against the glass windows, and the soft hum of conversations filled the room around them. Jeremy had just finished describing an important meeting earlier that day. "We're negotiating a major distribution contract," he said, leaning back in his chair. "If it goes through, it could expand our operations into 2 additional states." His partner nodded with a quick smile. "That sounds big," she replied. Jeremy waited for a moment. In the past, Stephen would have asked questions immediately. Questions about logistics, questions about risks, questions about how Jeremy planned to manage the growth without stretching his team too thin. Stephen had always listened carefully when Jeremy talked about business. She didn't interrupt often, but when she spoke, her questions pushed him to think more clearly. Those conversations had once sharpened his ideas. Now the conversation simply moved on. "What are we doing this weekend?" she asked, reaching for her drink. Jeremy blinked slightly. "We just talked about a major expansion plan," he said with a light laugh. "Yes," she replied casually, "but work will figure itself out. I was thinking about that new club opening downtown." Jeremy nodded slowly. The subject shifted. Later that evening, the same pattern repeated itself. Jeremy mentioned a complicated issue involving employee management and internal restructuring within his company. Again, she listened politely. Again, the response remained surface level. "That sounds stressful," she said. Then the conversation drifted toward shopping, travel plans, and upcoming social events. At first, Jeremy brushed off the difference. Not every person approaches business discussions the same way. Still, over the following weeks, he noticed the same pattern repeating. Whenever he spoke about challenges or deeper decisions, the conversation rarely lasted long. His partner seemed more interested in the benefits of his success than the process that created it. The contrast became clearer during a quiet evening at home. Jeremy sat in the living room reviewing documents on his laptop while discussing a complicated financial forecast out loud. "This projection doesn't account for seasonal supply disruptions," he said, mostly thinking aloud. "If that variable shifts, the entire margin changes." Across the room, she glanced up from her phone. "That sounds complicated." Jeremy waited. Years earlier, Stephen would have leaned forward at that point. She might have asked what caused the supply fluctuations. She might have suggested bringing in outside analysts to stress test the model. Stephen had never claimed to be an expert in Jeremy's industry, but she always approached problems with curiosity. Those conversations had forced Jeremy to explain his reasoning clearly. Sometimes they even improved his decisions. Now the discussion ended before it truly began. She returned to scrolling through her phone. Jeremy closed the laptop slowly. A strange thought passed through his mind. For the first time, he realized that none of his recent conversations had challenged him in the way Stephen once did. At social gatherings, his partner complimented his achievements. She praised his ambition. She admired the lifestyle his success provided. But admiration is not the same thing as understanding. Jeremy began noticing the difference in subtle ways. Stephen had never treated him like a celebrity inside his own home. If anything, she kept him grounded. When he became too focused on status or reputation, Stephen often redirected the conversation toward purpose. She cared less about how impressive something looked and more about whether it truly mattered. Jeremy had once appreciated that balance. Now he recognized something uncomfortable. The woman he had chosen after the divorce admired his success. Stephen had understood his character. Those are two very different things. The realization didn't arrive all at once. It appeared through several quiet evenings where conversations never moved beyond the surface. Through dinners where laughter came easily, but meaningful discussions never followed. Through moments where Jeremy spoke about serious decisions while the person across from him showed little curiosity about the deeper details. Slowly, Jeremy began remembering the years he had spent with Stephen. Not the arguments, not the tension during the final months of their marriage. The earlier years, the ones where Stephen's presence had balanced the chaos of his growing career. Stephen had never tried to impress him. She didn't compete with his success. She simply understood him. And understanding is far more rare than admiration. Jeremy sat alone one night after another social event ended early. The house was quiet again. He leaned back in his chair and stared at the dark screen of his laptop. For the first time since the divorce, a troubling question entered his mind. Had he confused excitement with compatibility? The thought lingered longer than he expected. because the more Jeremy compared the two relationships, the clearer one truth became. Stephine had not only loved him, she had challenged him. She had supported him. She had believed in him long before his name carried weight in business circles. And now she was gone. Jeremy pushed the thought away quickly. Regret, after all, only appears when someone begins questioning the decisions they once felt certain about, and Jeremy wasn't ready to admit that yet. But the first cracks in his confidence had already begun to appear. Jeremy didn't learn the truth about Stephine by looking for it. It found him. The discovery happened on a regular weekday afternoon inside his downtown office. Jeremy sat behind his desk reviewing several reports related to a possible expansion project. His company had been exploring opportunities to partner with larger logistics networks across Texas. The proposal required serious investment. Naturally, conversations with powerful investors had already begun. Jeremy leaned back in his chair while listening to a business presentation happening across the desk from him. Charts covered the laptop screen while numbers and projections filled the discussion. Transportation infrastructure is shifting, Jeremy said thoughtfully. Anyone positioned correctly right now could control a large portion of the market in the next decade. He tapped his pen lightly against the desk. The question is, which investment groups are already positioning themselves? The conversation continued for several minutes as Jeremy analyzed different players involved in the market. At one point, a name surfaced during the discussion. A company Jeremy had heard about before but never examined closely. They've been buying land and transportation routes quietly for years, Jeremy said. Who's behind that group? The answer came casually. Private ownership, the other person explained. Old money, very low public exposure. Jeremy leaned forward slightly. Do we know who runs it? There was a brief pause before the response came. Yes. Jeremy waited. Then the name was mentioned. Stephine's father. For a moment, Jeremy thought he had misunderstood. He stared across the desk, his expression tightening slightly. Wait, Jeremy said slowly. Say that again. The explanation came calmly. The company behind several major infrastructure acquisitions across Texas had been operating privately for decades. Its leadership avoided publicity. The wealth connected to it was enormous. And the person who controlled that empire was Stephine's father. Jeremy sat completely still. That's not possible, he said quietly. But the explanation continued. Stephine's father had built his reputation through quiet investments in logistics, transportation networks, and real estate long before Jeremy started his own company. His influence reached far beyond Houston. Multiple states, multiple industries. The financial estimates tied to his holdings placed him comfortably among the wealthiest private investors connected to the region. Jeremy felt something shift inside his chest. For years he had believed he understood Stephine's background. He believed she came from a modest neighborhood and built her life step by step through education and determination. Now another layer of the story appeared in front of him. Stephine's father had quietly paid for her university education. He had supported her early opportunities, not with public displays of wealth, but with the quiet stability that allowed her to focus on her own path. Jeremy leaned back in his chair slowly. His mind replayed years of conversations, moments where Stephine had listened calmly while he talked about his growing company, moments where he described his financial success with pride. Stephine had never challenged those moments. She never corrected him. She never explained the truth about her family. Jeremy swallowed. Why didn't she ever mention it? The answer came simply. She never used her family's wealth as an identity. Jeremy stared at the desk in front of him. For the first time since the divorce, the confidence he carried about his decisions began to crack in a serious way. Because suddenly several memories returned with new meaning. Jeremy remembered joking about upgrading Stephine's lifestyle during that dinner party months earlier. He remembered telling people he had lifted her into a world she didn't belong to. At the time, he believed those comments were harmless. Now the memory felt completely different. Stephine had never needed him to upgrade her life. She had simply chosen to build a life with him. Jeremy leaned forward and rested his hands on the desk. His thoughts began moving quickly. All those years, Stephine never mentioned the wealth surrounding her family. She never used it to influence Jeremy's business. She never compared their financial positions. She simply lived her life with the same calm humility she had always shown. And Jeremy had mistaken that humility for dependence. The realization hit harder with every passing second. Stephine had not married him because she needed financial security. She had married him because she loved him, Jeremy closed his eyes briefly. That truth carried a weight he wasn't prepared for, because suddenly the entire story of their marriage looked different. Stephine had chosen him freely, chosen him without expecting anything from his success, chosen him long before his company reached the level it had now, and Jeremy had thrown that choice away. Jeremy opened his eyes again slowly. For the first time since the divorce, a deep sense of regret settled firmly in his chest, not the mild discomfort he had felt during those quiet evenings at home. This felt heavier, more permanent. Jeremy had believed he understood the value of the life he was leaving behind. Now he realized he had misunderstood it completely, because the woman he replaced had never needed him. She had simply loved him. And sometimes the greatest mistake a person can make is failing to recognize the difference between being needed and being chosen. The realization about Stephine stayed with Jeremy long after that conversation in his office ended. At first he tried to return to work. The reports on his desk still needed attention. Emails continued arriving. Meetings remained scheduled throughout the week. But his concentration had changed. Numbers that normally made immediate sense now required extra effort. Conversations during business calls drifted past his focus as his thoughts kept returning to the same realization. Stephine had never needed him. She had chosen him. That difference reshaped everything Jeremy believed about their marriage. For years he thought he had been the one providing stability, the one creating opportunities, the one building a future that Stephine benefited from. Now he understood the truth was far more complicated. Stephine had entered the relationship with security he never bothered to understand, yet she never used it to impress him. She never compared their financial positions. She simply built a life beside him. Jeremy leaned back in his chair late one evening after most of his employees had already gone home. The office was quiet. For the first time in months, his thoughts turned fully toward Stephine instead of work. Memories appeared with uncomfortable clarity. The early years of their marriage. Stephine listening patiently during late-night conversations about business plans. Stephine encouraging him when his company struggled in the beginning. Stephine celebrating small victories long before his name carried influence in Houston's business circles. Those memories felt heavier now, because Jeremy could also remember the later years, the jokes he made about her upbringing, the dismissive tone that crept into his voice, the confidence he carried when he told her the marriage was over. Jeremy rubbed his hands across his face slowly. For the first time since the divorce, he allowed a difficult thought to settle in his mind. He had made a serious mistake. The realization didn't feel dramatic. It felt quiet, solid, impossible to ignore. Jeremy reached for his phone. For several minutes, he stared at Stephine's contact information. During the months following the divorce, he had avoided contacting her completely. Part of him believed that distance made everything easier. Now the silence felt wrong. He pressed the call button before he could reconsider. The phone rang several times. Jeremy's heartbeat quickened slightly while he waited. Then the call ended without an answer. Jeremy lowered the phone slowly. He told himself that was understandable. Stephine had every reason not to speak with him. Still, he tried again the following day. Another call. Another unanswered attempt. This time, Jeremy sent a message. The words took longer to write than he expected. He typed a short sentence first, then deleted it, then tried again. Finally, he sent something simple. "I'd like to talk if you're willing." Hours passed without a response. Jeremy tried focusing on work again, but the message sat quietly in his thoughts throughout the day. Late that evening, his phone vibrated. Stephine had replied. Jeremy opened the message immediately. "What is there left to talk about?" Jeremy read the sentence twice before responding. "I owe you a conversation." The reply took longer this time. Jeremy waited nearly half an hour before the next message appeared. Conversations usually come before divorce papers. Jeremy exhaled slowly. She was right. Still, he typed another response. "You deserve an apology." Several minutes passed. Then Stephine sent another message. "Apologies don't change decisions." Jeremy stared at the screen for a moment. His fingers hovered above the keyboard again. "I know, but I still need to say it." The typing indicator appeared briefly, then disappeared, then appeared again. Finally, a new message arrived. "One conversation, that's all." Jeremy felt a small sense of relief. "Thank you," he replied quickly. Stephine responded with a short message giving a location and time. A coffee shop in Houston. The meeting would happen 2 days later. Jeremy set his phone down slowly after reading the message. For the first time since discovering the truth about Stevine's background, he felt a cautious sense of possibility. Not certainty, not confidence, just the faint hope that maybe the conversation could change something. Jeremy didn't know what Stevine planned to say during that meeting. He didn't know whether forgiveness was even possible. But one thing had become clear. The man who once believed he had everything figured out was now hoping for a second chance he had never imagined needing. The coffee shop sat on a quiet corner several miles from downtown Houston. It wasn't the kind of place Jeremy usually visited. The building was modest, with large windows facing the street and a small patio where a few customers sat enjoying the late afternoon sun. Inside, the atmosphere felt calm. Soft music played in the background while the scent of fresh coffee filled the air. Jeremy arrived early. He chose a table near the window and sat down with a cup of coffee he barely touched. His eyes drifted toward the entrance every few minutes. Waiting had never been something Jeremy enjoyed. In business, he preferred being the one others waited for. But today felt different. Today he was the one hoping someone would walk through that door. After several minutes, Stevine appeared outside the window. Jeremy noticed her immediately. She walked with the same calm presence she had carried for years. Nothing about her posture suggested anger or hesitation. She stepped inside the shop and looked around briefly until their eyes met. Jeremy stood as she approached the table. "Hi," he said quietly. Stevine nodded politely. "Hello, Jeremy." They sat down across from each other. For a moment neither of them spoke. The quiet between them felt heavier than the conversations happening around the shop. Jeremy studied her face carefully. Stevine looked exactly the same as she had during the divorce hearing. Composed, peaceful. The absence of bitterness unsettled him more than anger would have. Finally, Jeremy spoke. "Thank you for agreeing to meet." Stevine folded her hands calmly on the table. "You said you needed to talk." Jeremy nodded. "Yes." He hesitated briefly before continuing. "I've been thinking a lot about everything that happened." Stevine didn't respond immediately. Instead, she waited. Jeremy took a slow breath. "I made a mistake," he said. The sentence sounded simple, but Jeremy felt the weight behind it. Stevine tilted her head slightly. "Which one?" she asked. Jeremy looked down at the table. "All of it." Stevine studied him quietly. Jeremy continued speaking. "I thought I understood what I wanted," he said. "I thought I understood our marriage." Stevine leaned back slightly in her chair. "And now?" Jeremy met her eyes again. "Now I realize I didn't." Stevine remained calm. Jeremy pressed forward. "I should have fought for our marriage instead of walking away from it." Stevine listened without interrupting. Jeremy leaned forward slightly. "I didn't appreciate what we had." Stevine's expression softened just slightly, but her voice remained steady. "You're realizing that now?" Jeremy nodded. "Yes." Stevine took a small sip of her coffee before responding. "What changed?" Jeremy hesitated. For a moment he considered explaining how he had learned about her father's wealth. But something stopped him. That explanation felt wrong. The truth mattered more than the discovery. "I started thinking about the way you supported me," Jeremy said. "The way you challenged my decisions, the way you believed in me before my company succeeded." Stevine watched him carefully. Jeremy continued. "I didn't value that the way I should have." Stevine placed her cup down gently. "No," she said quietly. "You didn't." Jeremy lowered his eyes briefly. "I know." Stevine waited for him to continue. Jeremy cleared his throat. "I'm asking if there's any way we can fix what I broke." The question hung in the air between them. Stevine didn't react immediately. Instead, she looked out the window for a moment. Cars moved slowly through the intersection outside. People walked past the coffee shop without realizing the conversation happening inside. After several seconds, Stevine turned back toward Jeremy. "Jeremy," she said softly. "Yes?" "You're apologizing now because you finally see the value of what you lost." Jeremy opened his mouth slightly, but Stevine continued. "That's not the same thing as understanding it when it mattered." Jeremy remained silent. Stevine's tone remained calm. "You didn't come to me when you felt our marriage slipping," she said. "You didn't try to repair it." Jeremy swallowed. "I know. You made your decision first." Jeremy nodded slowly. "Yes." Stevine folded her hands again. "And now you're asking me to reopen a door you closed." Jeremy leaned forward slightly. "I'm asking if it's possible." Stephen looked at him carefully. For a brief moment, Jeremy allowed himself to hope. But Stephen's eyes carried something he hadn't fully recognized before. Not anger. Not resentment. Closure. And closure is difficult to reverse. Jeremy waited quietly for her answer. The decision rested entirely in Stephen's hands now. Stephen looked at Jeremy for a long moment after his question hung between them. The coffee shop remained calm around them. A few customers spoke quietly at nearby tables. Someone near the counter laughed softly at something on their phone. Life continued normally for everyone else, but for Jeremy, everything seemed to pause while he waited for Stephen's answer. Stephen finally spoke. "Jeremy," she said gently. Jeremy straightened slightly in his chair. "Yes?" Stephen held his gaze, her expression calm but thoughtful. "I believe you when you say you regret what happened." Jeremy felt a small sense of relief hearing those words. Stephen continued, "I believe you're being honest about realizing your mistake." Jeremy nodded slowly. "I am." Stephen rested her hands lightly on the table. "But regret and repair are two different things." Jeremy's relief faded slightly. Stephen didn't rush her words. "You didn't just hurt my feelings," she said. "You made a decision that changed our lives." Jeremy lowered his eyes. "I know." Stephen continued speaking, her voice steady. "When we were married, I stood beside you through the years when your company was still growing. I listened when you were frustrated. I celebrated every small step forward." Jeremy remembered those moments clearly. Stephen had been there long before the public success arrived. Stephen looked out the window briefly before returning her attention to him. "But somewhere along the way, you stopped seeing me as your partner." Jeremy didn't argue. Stephen continued, "You started believing you were the one lifting me up." Jeremy winced slightly at those words. Stephen noticed the reaction. "I remember the dinner where you joked about upgrading my life," she said quietly. Jeremy's stomach tightened. That comment stayed with me. Stephen didn't sound angry as she spoke. She sounded reflective. "At the time, I realized something important," she said. "You had started believing your success gave you authority over the relationship." Jeremy rubbed his hands together slowly. "I didn't realize how that sounded." Stephen nodded. "I know." Jeremy looked up again. "I understand that now." Stephen studied him carefully. "Yes," she said softly. "You understand it now." The words carried a quiet truth Jeremy couldn't escape. Stephen leaned back slightly in her chair. "But understanding something after you destroy it doesn't rebuild it." Jeremy's chest felt heavy. "I'm willing to do the work," he said. "Whatever it takes." Stephen shook her head gently. "That's the problem." Jeremy frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Stephen's voice remained calm. "You're offering effort now that the loss has become real to you." Jeremy stayed silent. Stephen continued, "Real love doesn't wait until something disappears before it decides to value it." The words landed with quiet weight. Jeremy realized there was nothing he could say to argue with that truth. Stephen took a slow breath. "When you told me you wanted a divorce," she said, "something inside me changed." Jeremy listened carefully. "I didn't fight you," she continued, "not because I didn't care about the marriage." Jeremy knew that already. "You didn't fight because you had already left," he said quietly. Stephen nodded once. "Yes." Jeremy felt the finality in that simple answer. Stephen leaned forward slightly. "Jeremy, I didn't lose you that day." Jeremy looked confused. Stephen explained gently. "I lost you months earlier when you stopped respecting me." Jeremy looked down at the table again. Stephen continued, "By the time we signed those papers, the marriage had already ended emotionally." Jeremy sat silently while the truth settled into the space between them. Stephen picked up her coffee cup, finishing the last sip before placing it back on the table. Then she looked at Jeremy again. "You asked if we could fix what happened." Jeremy nodded slowly. "Yes." Stephen smiled softly, but there was no romance in the smile, only kindness. "Some lessons only come after we lose something important," she said. Jeremy felt the weight of those words immediately. Stephen stood from her chair. Jeremy remained seated, watching her carefully. "You're going to be successful, Jeremy," she said. He looked up. "You already are," Stephen continued. "But success doesn't replace respect." Jeremy said nothing. Stephen picked up her bag. "I hope the next person you love receives the appreciation I once hoped for." Jeremy swallowed hard. Stefine paused for one final moment. "Take care of yourself," she said gently. Then she turned and walked toward the door. Jeremy watched her cross the coffee shop and step outside into the Houston afternoon. She didn't look back. The door closed quietly behind her. Jeremy remained at the table long after she left. For the first time in a long while, the noise of the world around him faded into the background. Stefine's words repeated in his mind. Some lessons only come after we lose something important. Jeremy had believed power, success, and confidence made him untouchable, but life had just taught him something far more humbling. Love cannot survive where respect disappears. And sometimes the most painful truth a person can face is realizing that the greatest mistake of their life cannot be undone. Life has a way of revealing character through the choices people make. Some people only recognize the value of love after it's gone. Jeremy believed his success gave him control over every part of his life. But relationships are not business contracts. They are built on respect, loyalty, and the willingness to grow together. Stefine didn't walk away because she was weak. She walked away because she understood something many people take years to learn. Love should never require someone to shrink themselves just to keep it alive. And sometimes the most powerful decision a person can make is closing the door on someone who never truly valued the heart they were given. Before you go, I want to ask you something. Have you ever watched someone lose something valuable simply because they didn't recognize its worth until it was gone? Jeremy believed money, success, and attention meant he could always replace what he had. But Stefine proved something many people forget. Real love is not easy to replace. And respect. Once it disappears, it rarely comes back. So I want to hear from you. Do you think Jeremy truly deserved a second chance, or did Stefine make the right decision by walking away? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read them, and your perspectives always bring powerful conversations to this community. If this story touched you or reminded you of someone who needs to hear this message, please share this video with them. Sometimes a story can help someone see their own situation more clearly. And if you enjoy meaningful stories about love, life decisions, and the lessons that shape who we become, make sure you like the video and subscribe to Mr. Graham's Stories. Your support keeps these stories coming. Until the next story, remember this: the right person doesn't realize your value after losing you. They recognize it while they still have you.